Welcome to another edition of the Marc Steiner Show here on The Real News. Good to have you all with us. And as many of you know, we have two series rolling. One is Not in Our Name, which are conversations with mostly Jews from across the globe saying no to the occupation and the far-right government in Israel. And The Rise of the Right, which looks at the rise of the right wing and neo-fascists nationally and globally and what we can do about it. Well, today's conversation is like an intertwining of those two themes. I'm sitting down with Aparna Gopalan, who is a news editor at Jewish Currents and wrote an article for them called The Hindu Nationalists Using the Pro-Israel Playbook. Now, this is a strange but not surprising synergy between Israel and India. The rise of neo-fascist movements in both countries, both of whom have far-right governments now, both having important diaspora communities in this country, in the United States, both countries with deep alliances with the U.S., and the ties between India and Israel are deepening as they become two of the most repressive right-wing governments on the planet. So we're going to look at all that. And so one of the questions I had reading this article, I've been thinking about a lot, is how did two peoples who lived under oppression, who fought for the liberation, be represented by such far-right governments and movements now? In her article, Aparna Gopalan tackles the complex issue with depth and clarity. She's news editor at Jewish Currents. She's a social anthropologist with a degree from Harvard University, an editor at Indian Times and Boston Review before, and was lead organizer of the Harvard Graduate Students Union. And Aparna, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So this is really, it's when you look at the rise and the power of the right-wing world, on our planet at the moment, everywhere. I mean, you can't look at any nation on the planet, or anything in our own country here in the United States, where you don't see the rise of the right. So I was thinking as I was reading your piece, what your analysis is about how in India and in Israel both, the rise of the right has taken over, and what the dynamic was that allowed that. Both peoples rising out of oppression, throwing off yokes of colonialism, post-Holocaust, but clearly there's a lot of complexity there, and led to this moment of Modi in India and the right-wing government in Israel. How do you explain that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Post-2016 in this country, there was a lot of interest in looking at all the right-wing regimes across the world and talking about how all of them are coming up at the same time. But I feel like this story, with regards to India at least, and I think also with regards to Israel and other places, is much longer. So in India, the right-wing movement that I'm looking at basically started in the 1920s with European fascism. So there was these right-wing leaders who were visiting Italy under Mussolini and who were visiting Nazi Germany, and they were reading, Hitler and Mussolini's writings, and they were learning this ideology of race pride and how to articulate it and what kind of movement to build. And they were looking at the successes of European fascism and thinking, we want to build something just like that. And that is the movement that is in power today in India, that has finally, after 100 years, won political office. They've taken over the judiciary. They've taken over the executive branch, and they're making laws. And so in some sense, I think this is a fruition of a very long-standing effort that has been on pause at different moments. So during the independence struggle, for example, there was a very strong push to create a Hindu India that came out of British independence, but it was foiled by secular forces which were stronger for that moment. And that kind of kept happening throughout the history of modern India, that there was a Hindu right push and kind of there was a balancing force. And I think what's happened recently since the 1990s is that the balancing force has gone away or has weakened, and the Hindu right force has become so strong because they have just systematically, in a very grassroots fashion, something that we really need to look at and learn from. They've built a ground game. And so they have branches in every village, in every small town, and they are basically going and talking to people. They're doing the things that we on the left say we want to be doing. It's like really reaching everyday people, working people. They've done that, and they've done that for decades. And so this right now, what's happening in India is really the most complete success of fascism. It's kind of, in some sense, unlike what was happening in the US, because people would say Trump doesn't represent the working man or whatever. And maybe to some extent that was true. But in India, Modi does really represent the working man. Like they truly have built it from the ground up. So that's what's very terrifying about it. And I feel like that long history is important to understand to really contend with what's happening.
The movement, and if I mispronounce this, please correct my pronunciation. Hindutva, is that right? Hindutva,
Yep.
which is the kind of this larger right wing sensibility and movement in India. But it's like when you look at the history and you know that it was a Hindutva activist who assassinated Gandhi, right? And now they're in
Yeah.
power. And you thought about the parallels with the United States, that the right wing in this country has been organizing intensely since the early 70s and built the power that they have, where they control 26 states in our country now, literally growing power. And it's similar to what happened in India. I mean, what you were describing about how they kind of amassed this power over years with the fall of the Congress Party and what was the left in India, which seems to have dissipated.
Precisely. Yeah. I think that to whatever extent there was a left in India, the Congress Party, which is the kind of secular party that opposes Modi's BJP, the Congress Party has done its share to crush the left in India for many decades since independence. So they have been arresting communists and they have been crushing, unions, and they've been taking over tribal land and doing development work on it. And they've been doing that for so long that they've basically erased any base that we would have for a working class movement, and then the far right Hindutva comes in and kind of takes advantage of that. So it's not unlike what's happening in this country, really, where the Democrats, they waffle and they don't go far enough, and they make it impossible for working people to organize, and of course who takes advantage of that is the far right. So it's a very similar dynamic.
As I was reading the pieces you wrote and some of the attachments that you linked to, the question is, when you look at India now and look at the power India has and the growing relationship between the United States government, Israel, and India, and this kind of weird triad that's taking place, that's taking on the Muslim world, but also taking on the post-communist world as well. I mean, so let's talk a bit about those roots and how you see that playing out in India in terms of the population and the people's political attitudes.
Yeah, I think a lot of the geopolitical strategy that's involved in this alliance is coming out of 9/11. But like you mentioned, taking on the Muslim world, but some of it is actually predates that. So this is an excellent book that I cite in my piece extensively by this journalist called Azad Issa, who basically, the book is called Hostile Homelands, and it's about India and Israel's relationship over the decades, starting in the 20s and all the way down to now. And India actually used to be one of the most pro-Palestine, forces in the world, standing with the colonized people. And that really changes in the 70s and 80s, and especially the 90s, when India realizes that, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, we want to be closer to the US. To be closer to the US, we have to be close to Israel. We cannot be anti-Israel, or we won't be allowed into the US's orbit. And that's when this kind of switch happens of really inviting Israeli leaders to India, going to Israel, having these trade deals, and there's a weapons boom in India. Basically, India's buying weapons and frantically kind of expanding their military. They're doing nuclear tests, and Israel is, of course, key to a lot of that. And so that's the moment at which the partnership really intensifies, and I think it really comes to a head. I talk about in my piece around 2005, when India basically wants to be exempted from nuclear non-proliferation across the world. They don't want to, they basically want to develop nukes, and nobody else is doing that. And they want the blessing of the US to do that. And who helps them achieve that goal is the Jewish lobby in Washington. So there's leaders from the American Jewish Committee, there's leaders from AIPAC who are writing op-eds, who are writing letters, who are giving informal advice to their Hindu nationalist counterparts to help them secure this nuclear deal. There's actually certain members of the India caucus in the US Congress who are long-standing, Jewish lobby members as well. And they go and talk to President Bush at the time, and they convince him that we need India to be strong to counter Pakistan and to just shore up the whole area. And then India wins this nuclear deal, which is really like a game-changing win for India. And it changes the dynamic in the subcontinent altogether. And kind of flexes the muscle. And who's behind that is really like Jewish groups in the US. So the partnership has this geopolitical root, and it's really only growing. India and Israel have arms deals worth billions of dollars now. And, we saw Modi visiting Washington recently, and the kind of welcome he got here really matches the welcome he's getting when he goes to Israel. So I guess that's the answer to the question of like, why is this happening? In terms of the political attitudes of everyday people, I don't know that everyday people are saying we need to buy arms from Israel or we need to
Right,
develop
right,
nukes.
right,
Like
right, right.
that's not how they're being pulled in. They're being pulled in with this question of like national pride. Like, are you proud to be a Hindu? And we're gonna do you proud on the national on the global stage. The US is gonna like sit down. I mean, the way that Modi marketed his US visit in India is really incredible. What if you were in India, you were reading a newspaper there, you would think that no other political leader in the history of the world has ever been welcomed to the US the way that Modi has. No one else has ever had a state dinner. No one else has ever walked on a red carpet, and it's really, so I feel like that kind of marketing campaign is being done really well, and it's a year ahead of India's general election next year. So it's all very strategically done, but I don't think everyday people are as invested in the actual like defense goals as in being proud Hindus or something.
So, after reading your piece, and as I was thinking about is how you analyze the importance and depth of the Israeli-Indian relationship and what that means for the future, but also how it plays out here, because Indians are the second largest diaspora group in the United States, immigrant group in the country. The ties between the right wing parts of the Indian community, right wing parts of the Jewish community are really intense in this country. Much of it built around anti-Muslim fervor. So I'm curious how you analyze that in terms of what all that portends, both internationally and here in our country.
Yeah, this is one of the things working at Jewish Currents. As an outlet, Jewish Currents basically covers the dangers of the kind of pro-Israel playbook in the US. And, I feel like we've been saying for a really long time that this is a very dangerous strategy they've developed in which you have this whole propaganda machine, and any activist who speaks out against Israel's human rights violations is on canary mission the next day, and has trouble getting jobs and is like struggling to enter Israel, and it's this kind of really a machine that's working very effectively to stop people from talking. And we've been saying for a long time that this is dangerous, and I feel like now with this development with Hindu right groups, we have proof that it's dangerous because it can be exported. It's just a strategy that you can just copy and paste into a completely different context, and it's working just as well. So after my article came out, my name was in the like Hindu Canary Mission, and I was. I mean, it's basically the same kind of like the army of like internet trolls. They come after you. There's people who are making note of you to make sure that next time you want to enter India or next time you want to go speak about this issue or get a job or something, that they've made note of it, that you are anti-India, you're anti-national, and it's very reminiscent of what's been happening with kind of Israel critics, but it's not just reminiscent; they're actually talking to each other. So I was really impressed by. I talked to a lot of Hindu nationalists in reporting the piece, and I would ask them, do you see any parallels between what you're doing and kind of Israel advocacy? And I thought that they would shy away from it, but they proudly would declare like, we talk to Israel advocates. I love, like, we talk to the ADL all the time, and they like taught us how to do, they actually taught us how to make this concept Hindu phobia. Because we saw what they were doing with anti-Semitism, and we were like, we wanted to be just like that. And then we had meetings with them, and then and then we basically have this thing, Hindu phobia, and look, it's just like anti-Semitism. They would kind of show like a point-by-point comparison of both the definitions and explain how they're basically mapping what they're doing onto the Israel advocacy. So the ramifications are huge, because if tomorrow there's another ethno-nationalist movement, right, which has a diaspora in the US, and that diaspora wants to make sure that what's happening in the homeland is left alone, that the US supports it, the US doesn't intervene. All they have to do is copy this playbook, and they have to go talk to the Israel groups, they have to go talk to the Hindu groups, and they will be in on the action as long as all the geopolitical incentives line up. So it's very worrying that the Israel playbook has proved itself to be so versatile, and that the Jewish groups have proved themselves to be so willing to help other far right movements.
So it also makes me wonder about a couple of things. Let me just take one at a time. How that plays out here in this country, in the United States, inside the Indian community? There's clearly, I mean, it's not a unanimity. It's not a monolith where everybody
Mm-hmm.
supports Modi, right? And clearly, one of the things you linked to was the Carnegie poll, which showed the divide inside the Indian community about supporting Modi or not supporting Modi. So how does that dynamic figure into this, do you think? And how does it play out?
So one thing that's very interesting about what I'm calling the Hinduphobia strategy is it's drawing on a real experience that a lot of Indian Americans have, which is we all experience US racism in some way or the other, right?
Right.
We're called names. We're basically brown people as soon as you move to the US, and you kind of are on that rung of the totem pole, even though Indian Americans are relatively wealthier and more highly educated and stuff like that. There's still like everyday experiences of racism and feeling alienated from this country. What is really remarkable about Hinduphobia is that it basically acts upon that fear. So, the people who are worried about Hinduphobia will tell you, and they told me, my sources, my Hindu nationalist sources, tried to scare me when I was reporting the piece, and they would tell me, they're coming for you. And they would kind of talk about like experiences of racism, about like, they would like draw some religious symbols on their doorstep, and then like the neighbors would complain that like this shouldn't be here or something like that.
That actually happened?
Those are stories that they would tell me in reporting.
Yeah.
But yes, the interviews were a recruitment pitch for them, because they were basically like, you're a young Hindu, this is what's going on in our community. You should be really, really afraid right now. And because because everything is in danger, like what we need to do is like band together and support our movement. And our movement, of course, is Hindutva, and they wouldn't say that, but basically that's the way in which they're recruiting American Hindus, because American Hindus, like you said, are very divided. American Indians are divided. They don't all support Modi. But the more that you are able to kind of connect to their everyday lived experience of racism and tell them that that's going to keep getting worse unless you join this kind of Hindu movement globally that we are all creating to protect ourselves and protect our children, then you're in danger. And so that's a very effective recruitment pitch. I mean, it didn't work on me, but I could see it working on somebody else. And it's really remarkable, because they who's coming for you is not like white nationalists, which is who you would think, you're in danger of, but it's actually Muslims who are going to come for you, or like lower caste people, oppressed caste people who are going to come for you. And so that's what I was kind of told over and over again, is I need to watch out for all those kinds of Indian minorities in the US and how they might become too powerful unless I join these groups that I'm interviewing and become an activist and basically become a Hindu nationalist. So that's the way in which the Hindu nationalist groups are trying to bridge the divide within the Indian community, by really just a politics of fear. And again, very similar to anti-Semitism and how it's being used to recruit Jews for the cause of Israel. So if there's an attack in New York, the ADL will say, look, Jews are in danger.
Right.
Donate money to us so we can defend Israel. So it's this really, yeah.
And it becomes complex and difficult because anti-Semitism is real and it runs deep. Mm-hmm. And anti-Hindu feeling can run deep as well. I mean, on lots of racist levels in this country and across the globe. So if you play on that reality and use it to not unite people against their oppression and to fight for a better world, but if you use that to unite people out of the fear, which is what you're saying is happening, that builds a different kind of movement and a dangerous movement.
Precisely. They're not saying that, look, there's a rise in anti-immigrant violence, right? So we need to all unite against white nationalism, against Christian nationalism. That's not what their goal is. They don't want to unite with other working people. They don't want to unite with if there's anti-Chinese violence. They basically, Hindu nationalist groups told me, anti-Hindu violence is completely different from any other anti-Asian violence.
We're special.
This is like right, exactly. We are in unique danger, and so we have to act as Hindus. We don't have to act as Asians, as people of color. Those are not the identities. You're a Hindu first. And that's really the kind of foundation of the Hindu nationalist movement.
So on the other side of that, you wrote about, if I have this remember correctly, Hindus for Human Rights,
mm-hmm.
and the interaction that organization, that group of advocates has with things like JVP, Jewish Voices for Peace, and others. So what about that dynamic? Is that A, significant? B, is it growing? And how do you think that fits into this?
It definitely is significant. I in the process of reporting found out that not only is Hindus for Human Rights, which is a progressive Hindu group, talking to Jewish Voice for Peace, they're literally modeled on Jewish Voice for Peace. So they are basically one of the people who founded the group went to Jewish Voice for Peace and said, I want to found a group which is like Hindus who are speaking out as Hindus against Hindu nationalism. Will you help me? And Jewish Voice for Peace said yes. And so they helped. And so this group is modeled on the image of Jewish Voice for Peace. And that's really important because, like I said, the same playbook is being used against both of these progressive groups. And so they are, by uniting, they're kind of like bringing together. We, as the progressive Hindus now, are able to draw on the expertise that a group like JVP has in dealing with, this repressive and silencing playbook. And it's really interesting how the collaboration works because when Modi came to visit, the very same people who would speak up against Israel in Congress, for example, are the same people who spoke up against Modi. So Rashida Tlaib said, I'm not going to attend Modi's congressional address. Ilhan Omar said, I'm not attending that address, and I'm actually having a briefing on human rights right after the address so senators can and Congress people can learn more about what's happening in India. So it's kind of it's very clever in some ways by progressive Hindus because we're able to draw on an existing political formation, right? And we don't have to start from scratch. And we shouldn't have to because it's the same struggle on both fronts. So I think it's very important. One thing I will say, which again, Azad Isa, the journalist, pointed out to me, and I think is exactly right, is the anti-Zionist groups like JVP are coming from a really long tradition of working class activism, whereas groups like Hindus for Human Rights are very new still, and there actually isn't a huge Indian diaspora working class movement. There aren't, basically like most of the people who are speaking up are still people who are relatively upper caste, they're still upper class. And so we still are struggling to engage with working people within our community. And I think that's really where the fight will be won. We need to engage the like people who do everything in India, who are the farmers and the laborers. And so that's kind of ground game that is still absent, both in the US and in India. And unless that is built, I don't see, how Modi gets taken down by a movement like this, for example.
So that kind of leads me to where you think your analysis takes you and us when it comes to this far-right government in India that has literally attacked the Muslim population, burning down mosques and the riots that have taken place over the last 30-odd years in India, and what's happening in Israel with the rise of the far-right government, and that powerful synergy with the alliance with the United States. I think this is almost it's one of those hidden dangers that our future faces that we don't put together in this puzzle, which you were doing in this article.
Yeah, I think that one thing that I was impressed by when my sources were telling me about the reason that there is this huge effort to, call any criticism of Hindu nationalism as Hinduphobia, the reason that there's that effort is because the risk is really great. So India stands to lose a lot if the US actually acts against India and India's human rights violations. For example, the US has this report that an independent government agency releases every year, and for the past 4 years this like religious freedom report has said India should be on a blacklist for like violations of religious freedom. That's been the recommendation being made to the State Department hasn't acted on it yet. They could, though. Tomorrow they could wake up and say, we are going to act on this because our own agencies are recommending this. And if that happens, India stands to lose a great deal. They stand to lose they stand to face sanctions if the US wants to go that far. But before that, they stand to lose their arms deals with US companies. They stand to lose their trade and technology deals with US companies. And all of those threats are why there's so much activity to stop that outcome. And I feel like, I guess, so what I'm saying is the situation, like you said, is very grim in both Israel and India, right? In India, if there's 10 stages of genocide, and India is at stage 8, according to a report by Georgetown University. So basically, we're 2 stages away from a complete genocide of Muslims in India. And in Israel, we're seeing a very similar situation where, Palestinians are literally being just expelled from the West Bank. So the situation is really grim. But at the same time, the amount of activity that's happening in the US to silence, speech about the situation gives some degree of hope that, like, there's still a chance that the US could act. both against India, much more easily actually against India, because India and the US don't have a special relationship.
Right.
But also the US could act against Israel. There's efforts to do that also. There's efforts to take out money from settlements, take out US government money from settlements. And that's a signal that this is not okay. So in both cases, there is real potential for change, but it's urgently needed, because in both cases, we're really almost at the end of the road in terms of like how bad things could get. Like they almost couldn't get any worse in both places.
So, in kind of conclude, I was thinking about a couple of things here. One is, and you touched on this a bit in the article, but I'm really, really interested in how you see it playing out domestically in the United States within the Indian community. I mean, because when you look at the Jewish community in America, you see this divide, and part of it is generational, but there's a political divide that's building around Israel and the occupation and the right wing government. How do you see that playing out here in this country with the Indian population in America and the battle around Modi and the right wing in India?
A big part of both of these fights is really young people and college campuses. And in the Hindu diaspora, in the Indian diaspora, really there's groups on both sides. So there's Hindu nationalist groups who heavily recruit on college campuses, and they basically recruit through holding cultural events. They'll be like, this is a Diwali celebration, and then you'll show up there, and you end up on a mailing list, and then the mailing list invites you to progressively more Hindu right events, and pretty soon you're a Hindu right activist, right? And then they'll like try to position you in a Capitol Hill internship. They'll try to connect you to like the RSS, which is the kind of paramilitary group that's at the heart of Hindu nationalism in India. And before you know it, you're a Hindu nationalist leader. So that's the effort on the Hindu nationalist side. But there are counter efforts by people who are opposing Hindu nationalism. And that's really where all our hope lies. So there's student groups who have decided that on every Indian festival, we're going to have some event of our own. We're not just going to be silent. We're not just going to give up on Hinduism. We're going to enter the fray, and we're going to say, here is a progressive interpretation of Diwali, or here is Holi, which is an Indian holiday, but on this holy event, we're going to talk about political prisoners. And that's, we're not going to let ourselves off the hook. And so again, not in our name is kind of what these student groups are saying. And that's so it's hard to predict kind of where the balance of forces is. To be really frank, right now the Hindu rights on campus game in the US, ground game, is much stronger. They've been doing it for decades, and these other groups are just forming during the pandemic. Really, they've started. Hindus for Human Rights was founded in 2019, right? And their most direct rivals were founded in 2002, and of course the RSS was founded in 1920s.
Right.
So we're catching up to hundreds of years and so I mean, yeah, if this trend continues where there's student groups and kind of like anti-caste groups which are forming, especially again among high school students and on campus, I think by the next generation we're going to see a very different Hindu American population. But there's every effort being made to make sure those groups don't succeed, because they're called Hindu-phobic immediately as soon as they come into existence. So that's really the contour of the struggle right now.
That's interesting. And I think as we wind out here, that what you just described, I mean, is two things. A hopeful look at where both Indian and Jewish populations in America could go in terms of fighting for the kind of progressive change, both in the Middle East and in India and in this country. I mean, that is, and the coming together of these groups is really something we have not really heard about. I've not heard about until I read your article, and then that's also confronted by the immense power of the right-wing political movements in India and in Israel. There's like there's contradictions are coming to a head here.
Yeah. And again, in both cases, again, also, this is the same with groups that are pro-Palestinian, right? Is they don't have the money on their side. The groups that have the money is AIPAC. AIPAC has money. The rest of us, what we have is we knock on doors or whatever. Like that's all that there is. So there's basically the tool that's in the hands of the progressives in both India and Israel is just raising consciousness to the point that you have enough people knocking on doors that you can defeat the AIPAC candidate in every town race and state race and federal race. And that's how you kind of make the change that's necessary. So it's like a really arduous fight against impossible odds. But again, that's the fight against the right, all in any context.
I don't know, it just popped in my head as you were saying that when you describe what was happening in Teaneck, New Jersey, and places like that. It is possible. Movements are building and they're growing, and to actually make these things happen, that to build something different.
There was actually this recent study. I'm gonna get the number wrong, but somebody did this report and they found out that maybe 40 or maybe 60%, which is different, but 40 or 60% of Americans have never heard of Modi. And I think that's a golden opportunity because that means that 40 or 60%, let's say 50% of Americans can still be educated about this by us, right? So we can start that conversation right now, and we have to get there first. We have to get there before the Hindu right groups get there and say this guy is the savior of the Hindus, and that's what needs to happen. I mean, I'm sure the state visit that Biden did will have changed that number and will have made things worse. So that's why these kinds of visits need to we need to fight back against like all these efforts to legitimize Modi, because really lots of people are still on the fence or have no idea who this is. So I think that's really where the fight is to make sure that we get there first and we get there with the full truth about what's happening.
I want to say, Aparna, it's really been great to meet you and to have this conversation. And I want folks to really check out this article. It'll be linked here. That the Hindu Nationalists using the pro-Israel playbook in Jewish Currents. It came out June 28th by Aparna Gopalan, their news editor. Just a really deeply thorough article that I'm not sure I did justice to, but it was an amazing piece of work. And I appreciate you taking the time here on the Marc Steiner Show on The Real News. And we should both move forward to create this American Jewish-Indian alliance for real change and make that happen. I think that's got real potential for the future.
That's the hope. If my article could have gone gotten us 1% closer to that alliance, that's all that's needed.
I think it did.
Thanks for having me, though. This is really great.
Thank you, Aparna. I hope you enjoyed our conversation today with Aparna Gopalan about her article in the Jewish Currents called "The Hindu Nationalists Using the Pro-Israel Playbook." Now, we'll be linking to the article so you can read it. It is well worth the read. And I want to thank you all for joining us today. Please let me know what you think about what you heard today, what you'd like us to cover. Just write to me at mss@therealnews.com, and I'll write right back to you. And while you're there, go to therealnews.com/support. Become a monthly donor and become part of the future with us. So for Cameron Granadino, David Hebden, Kayla Rivera, and the crew here at The Real News, I'm Marc Steiner. Stay involved, keep listening, stay in touch, and take care.
Thank you so much for watching The Real News Network, where we lift up the voices, stories, and struggles that you care about most. And we need your help to keep doing this work. So please, tap your screen now, subscribe, and donate to The Real News Network. Solidarity forever.